On the morning of June 24, 1941, a German supply convoy rolled down a narrow dirt road just north of the Lithuanian town of Raseiniai. The trucks were carrying fuel and ammunition to the forward units of the 6th Panzer Division, one of the fastest-moving formations in the entire German invasion of the Soviet Union. The road cut through flat, swampy terrain. Dense marshland pressed in from both sides. There was no way around. And there, squatting in the middle of that road, was a Soviet heavy tank. No one knew exactly when it had arrived. Local Lithuanian farmers told the Germans it had driven up the night before, stopped at the Crossroads, and simply sat there in the dark. It did not move. It did not fire. It waited. When the convoy appeared, the tank opened up. Within minutes, the lead trucks were burning. The rest turned and fled, and just like that, an entire German battle group, thousands of soldiers with hundreds of armored vehicles, found itself split in two. The tank had also torn through their telephone lines during its approach, cutting off Colonel Erhard Raus, the battle group commander, from his own division headquarters to the west. On a wartime map of the German advance, this crossroads would have been a speck. But for the men of the 6th Panzer Division, it was now the most dangerous piece of ground in Lithuania. A photograph taken after the fighting ended would show what the Germans were up against. A massive Soviet KV heavy tank, a machine most of them had never seen before, sat in the middle of the road. Its armor was dented and scarred in dozens of places. Scorch marks blackened the hull. Yet the steel had held almost everywhere. Over the next day, the Germans would throw nearly everything they had at this single tank: anti-tank guns, an 88mm anti-aircraft cannon, sapper teams with demolition charges in the dead of night, panzers used as decoys. 5 separate attacks, 5 different weapons, 5 failures. Each one left the tank sitting exactly where it was. This is the story of the Battle of Raseiniai, and one of the most remarkable last stands in the history of armored warfare. It is also the story of a crew whose names we may never fully know. To understand why one Soviet tank could stop an entire division, we need to step back 2 days and look at what was unfolding across the entire front. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. More than 3 million soldiers poured across the Soviet border along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. In the north, Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, drove through the Baltic states at a pace that stunned even the German High Command. Its armored spearhead was the 4th Panzer Group, commanded by General Erich Hoppner. Within that force, the 41st Panzer Corps pushed its 2 divisions, the 1st and the 6th, toward the Lithuanian road network that led to the vital river crossings beyond. The 6th Panzer Division was a powerful combined arms formation, built for speed and deep penetration. On the day the invasion began, it fielded approximately 240 tanks. But here was the detail that would matter enormously in the days ahead. The vast majority of those tanks, about 155 of them, were Panzer 35 T models. These were originally Czech-designed light tanks taken over when Germany absorbed Czechoslovakia in 1939. They were fast and reasonably reliable for their time, but they carried a 37mm gun and relatively thin armor. They had been built to fight other light tanks, not armored giants. The division also had about 30 Panzer IV medium tanks and roughly 47 Panzer IIs, which were even lighter. None of these carried a weapon that could reliably punch through heavy armor at standard combat range. The division was split into 2 battle groups for the advance. Kampfgruppe von Seckendorf pushed forward with motorized infantry and reconnaissance elements. Kampfgruppe Raus, commanded by Colonel Erhard Raus, was built around Panzer Regiment 11, 1 battalion of motorized infantry, an artillery battalion, a company of engineers, and anti-tank and anti-aircraft units. It was Raus's battle group that would soon find its supply road blocked by a machine it could not destroy. The Germans did not yet know it, but the Soviets had something entirely new waiting for them in Lithuania. The Kliment Voroshilov tank, known by its initials KV, was a heavy tank that had entered service in 1939. It was named after the Soviet Defense Commissar, a political figure, not a military engineer, but the tank itself was pure engineering. A technical drawing of the KV-1 shows its distinctive profile, a low, wide hull with a rounded cast turret sitting on top, the whole machine looking squat and immensely solid compared to the angular German designs of the same era. The hull and turret of the standard KV-1 model were protected by 75 mm of welded steel armor. On some production variants, the cast turret reached 95 mm. The entire machine weighed over 45 tons and was powered by a 12-cylinder diesel engine producing around 600 horsepower. Its main armament was a 76 mm cannon capable of destroying any German tank in the field at the time. 3 machine guns, one mounted in the hull, one next to the main gun, and one in the rear of the turret, gave the crew the ability to fight infantry approaching from any direction. Here was the critical fact. No standard German anti-tank gun deployed in June 1941 could reliably penetrate the KV's frontal armor at normal combat distances. The 37 mm guns on the Panzer 35T were essentially useless. Even the newer 50 mm Pak-38 anti-tank guns struggled against such thickness. The Soviet Tuken Tank Division, under Major General Yegor Solyankin, was one of the formations equipped with these heavy tanks. The division was part of the 3rd Mechanized Corps, which was ordered to counterattack the German advance near Raseiniai on June 23. According to historian David Glantz, the 3rd Mechanized Corps fielded over 650 tanks on the eve of the invasion, though only a fraction were the new KV models. Still, even a small number of KVs would be enough to cause chaos. When the 2nd Tank Division struck the Germans near Raseiniai June 23, the results were shocking. A German officer serving with the 1st Panzer Regiment later described how their armor-piercing shells simply bounced off the advancing Soviet tanks. The KVs drove straight through the German ranks. Some German tank crews were forced to pull alongside the Soviet machines at distances of 30 to 60 meters, point-blank range, just to attempt a disabling shot. In cases where Soviet KVs ran out of ammunition, they simply drove over the German anti-tank guns, crushing the weapons under their massive treads. A German after-action report recorded the scene with unusual honesty. The Soviet tanks had forced the Panzer Regiment to turn around and retreat alongside them, firing desperately at close range while trying to find weak points that did not seem to exist. But the Soviets were suffering too. The long road march to the battle, over 100 kilometers on dusty secondary roads, had clogged air filters and wrecked the KV's notoriously fragile transmissions. Soviet tank historian Steven Zaloga has noted that the KV's transmission, based on a decades-old design, was the vehicle's greatest weakness, and that there was some truth to stories of Soviet drivers shifting gears with a hand sledge. Many KVs broke down before they ever reached the fight. Fuel and ammunition were running dangerously low across the entire division. By the evening of June 23, the surviving Soviet tanks pulled back across the Dubysa River, a natural defensive line cutting across the Lithuanian plain. The 6th Panzer Division pushed forward and established 2 bridgeheads on the eastern bank. The main German supply road ran north from the town of Raseiniai to these bridgeheads, and it was somewhere along that road, sometime during the night of June 23, that a single Soviet KV heavy tank, separated from its unit, rolled to a crossroads and stopped. Historians still debate which variant this vehicle was. Colonel Rouse, the German battle group commander who wrote about the incident after the war, identified it as a KV-1. Other scholars, including Zaloga, have argued it was more likely a KV-2, a variant that carried an enormous 152 mm howitzer in a tall, boxy turret. The website Tank Archives, which translates original Soviet-era documents, notes that most historians lean toward the KV-2 identification, but that there is no certainty. For this story, we will simply call it what it was: a KV heavy tank. Russian military historian Maxim Kolomiets spent years researching this incident. He concluded that the tank probably belonged to the 3rd Company of the 1st Battalion of the 1st Battalion of the 4th Tank Regiment, part of the 2nd Tank Division. The most widely accepted explanation for why it stopped at the crossroads is straightforward. It ran out of fuel during the retreat. But the crew did not abandon their machine. They could have slipped out at night and disappeared into the forest. They did not. The Crossroads sat on soft, swampy ground, with marshland on both sides and no way for wheeled or even tracked vehicles to bypass it. The crew had placed themselves, whether by luck or by instinct, in the one spot where a single vehicle could shut down the entire division's supply line. On the morning of June 24, the first German column stumbled into the KV's line of fire. A convoy carrying wounded soldiers and prisoners westward toward Raseiniai spotted the tank and immediately turned back. Colonel Rouse was initially puzzled. The division had been expecting a major Soviet counterattack, and at first he assumed this was the beginning of one. But reconnaissance patrols reported the truth. There was no mass assault. There was one tank sitting alone in the middle of the road. A second convoy, this one loaded with fuel and ammunition bound for the isolated bridgeheads, tried the same road soon after. The KV opened fire with devastating effect. Rouse later recalled roughly 12 trucks burning in the aftermath. Columns of black smoke rose over the tree line. The tank then sat there, periodically firing shots toward German positions in Raseiniai itself. On a situation map at Rouse's field headquarters, the picture was simple and dire. The bridgeheads east of the Dubysa could not be resupplied. The 2nd Tank Division was still pressing attacks against those bridgeheads from the opposite direction. If this went on much longer, the entire German position along the river could collapse. Now let us count the German attempts to destroy this one machine. This is where the story becomes almost unbelievable. Attempt number 1. A battery of 50mm POC-38 anti-tank guns, the newest and most capable anti-tank weapons in the German infantry arsenal, was moved into position roughly 600 meters from the KV. The gun crew set up carefully and opened fire. The shells struck the tank. Impact after impact was confirmed. But the rounds could not penetrate the KV's thick armor. After absorbing hit after hit, the tank sat silent for several agonizing minutes. The German crews may have believed they had knocked it out. Then the turret began to turn. The KV's main gun swung toward the battery, and one by one, the tank destroyed every gun in the position. Several German soldiers were killed. The rest scattered into the woods, leaving behind wrecked weapons and empty shell casings. That was attempt number 1. A complete failure. Attempt number 2. A 105mm field howitzer was brought up to try an indirect approach. Howitzers fire in a high arc, dropping shells down onto the target from above. But hitting the single vehicle at safe range with indirect fire requires extraordinary luck. The shells fell around the KV, throwing up plumes of dirt and mud. But none struck it directly. That was attempt number 2. Another failure. Attempt number 3. This was the weapon the Germans believed would finally end the standoff. An 88mm Flak 18 anti-aircraft gun was towed forward from Raseiniai. The 88 was originally designed to shoot down aircraft flying at high altitude, but its high-velocity shell could pierce virtually any tank armor in the world in 1941. The gun crew positioned it roughly 730 meters behind the Soviet tank and began preparing to fire. What happened next speaks to the extraordinary composure of the KV's crew. According to Rouse's post-war account, the Soviet tankers calmly watched the 88 being towed into position. They did not fire while the gun was still moving. They understood a basic principle. The closer the gun came, the easier it would be to destroy. The critical moment arrived when the German crew began to unlimber the weapon and swing the barrel toward the KV. Inside the tank, the crew acted. The turret swung around. The Soviet gunner fired first. The 88mm gun and its towing vehicle were smashed before the German crew could get off an effective shot. In a single exchange, the most dangerous weapon available to the 6th Panzer Division had been eliminated. 3 attempts, 3 failures. An entire Panzer Division had thrown its anti-tank guns, its artillery, and its prized 88 at one tank, and it was still sitting in the road, still firing, still blocking the supply line. Traffic jams were building on both sides of the Crossroads as columns of German vehicles waited helplessly outside the KV's range. In a typed German report filed after the battle, The frustration is plain. No available weapon had managed to scratch the armor of a single enemy tank. As darkness fell on June 24th, Colonel Rouse turned to a different approach. If shells could not destroy the KV, perhaps explosives placed by hand could. Attempt number 4. A team of pioneer combat engineers was ordered to crawl through the darkness toward the tank and attach satchel charges directly to its hull or tracks. Satchel charges were canvas bags packed with high explosives, designed to be pressed against a target and detonated at close range. This was dangerous close-quarters work, requiring the sappers to approach within arm's length of a machine whose crew was clearly awake and ready to fight. The pioneers crept forward through the Lithuanian night. But the KV's crew was not sleeping. The moment the Germans came within range, the tank's machine guns opened fire. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness. Most of the sappers were driven back. A handful managed to get close enough to plant their charges and detonate them. There was a blast, and there may have been some damage to the tracks. But when the smoke cleared, the tank's hull was intact and the turret still turned. That was attempt number 4. The 4th failure in a row. Let us pause and consider what had happened. In the space of a single day, the 6th Panzer Division had deployed 4 different weapon systems against one stationary tank, 50mm anti-tank guns, a howitzer, an 88mm cannon, hand-placed demolition charges. 4 attacks, each more desperate than the last. None of them had worked. By the early hours of June 25, the KV had held the Crossroads for the better part of a full day. Inside the tank, conditions were unimaginable. The crew had endured the concussive hammering of dozens of anti-tank rounds at close range. Their hearing was almost certainly destroyed. The interior of a KV was cramped even in normal conditions, with poor ventilation and limited visibility. They had been sealed inside a steel box under the Lithuanian summer sun for many hours. They had no food, no water resupply, no ammunition resupply, and no hope of rescue. The rest of their division was falling back or being encircled to the east, and they were still fighting. Now Rouse devised a final coordinated plan. Attempt number 5. He would combine every available asset in one simultaneous strike. A group of Panzer 35T light tanks from Panzer Battalion 65 was ordered to advance from a nearby tree line and engage the KV head-on. Their 37mm guns could not damage it. Everyone knew this. The tankers inside those light Czech-built machines knew they were driving toward a weapon that could destroy them with a single shot. But their job was not to kill the KV. Their job was to draw the turret forward and hold the crew's attention. While the KV's crew tracked the approaching panzers, a second 88mm anti-aircraft gun was quietly moved into a camouflage position behind the Soviet tank. This time, the Germans took great care to keep the weapon hidden until the last possible moment. The panzers rumbled out of the woods, firing as they came. The KV's turrets swung toward them, just as Rouse had planned, and from behind, the concealed 88 opened fire. Several rounds struck the rear of the tank. Most of them still did not fully penetrate. 5 or 6 shells hit the turret and hull, but according to Rouse, only 2 rounds broke through the armor. Those 2 were enough to send fragments spalling through the interior, and the tank went silent. The turret stopped moving. After a long, tense pause, German infantry cautiously approached the enormous machine. They reached the hull and knocked on the armor. Then, incredibly, the turret began to rotate again. The crew had only been stunned by the impacts. One of the approaching soldiers reacted instantly. He pushed a grenade through one of the holes punched by the 88, and this time the explosion inside was final. The interior of the KV fell silent for the last time. When the Germans opened the hatches of the KV, they found the bodies of the crew inside. Most accounts report 6 men, the standard 5-person crew. A commander, a gunner, a loader, a driver, and a hull machine gunner, plus 1 unidentified person who may have been a soldier from another unit who climbed aboard during the chaotic retreat. The exact number varies slightly between sources, but 6 is the figure most widely reported. No one knew their names. Their personal identification documents had been lost or buried separately in the woods during the Soviet withdrawal. These men had fought and died anonymously. What happened next is the detail that gives this story its lasting power. The German soldiers of the 6th Panzer Division, the same men who had spent an entire day trying to destroy this crew, buried them nearby with full military honors. According to Rouse's memoir, the battle group commander was deeply moved by the courage of the Soviet tankers. These were men who had every chance to abandon their stricken vehicle under cover of darkness, slip into the surrounding forests, and try to find their own lines. They chose instead to stay inside a stranded machine, surrounded by the enemy, and fight until there was nothing left. A typed German after-action report filed in the following days noted the extraordinary resilience of the KV's armor. Of the many rounds that struck the tank over the course of the battle, only 2 from the final 88mm barrage had fully penetrated. Every 50mm shell had bounced off. Every satchel charge had failed to breach the hull. The first 88 never even got a shot off. Only the final deception, combining a diversionary tank attack with a concealed heavy gun firing from behind, had worked. In photographs taken of the knocked-out tank in the days that followed, the evidence is visible across the hull and turret. Dozens of impact craters, dents, and scorch marks cover the surface. Each mark is a record of another failed attempt. The armor had done exactly what the engineers at the Kirov plant in Leningrad had designed it to do. The broader Battle of Raseiniai continued for 3 more days after the Crossroads was cleared. By June 27th, the Soviet 3rd Mechanized Corps had been effectively destroyed. A report filed on July 11, 1941, by Colonel Poluboyarov of the Northwestern Front's Armored Directorate stated bluntly that the Corps had completely perished. Only about 400 men had escaped the encirclement, with just one surviving tank between them, a single light BT-7. The German advance rolled on toward the Dubysa River and eventually toward Leningrad. In the vast scale of Operation Barbarossa, the lone tank at the Crossroads near Raseiniai was a footnote, a delay of roughly 1 day in a campaign that would rage for 4 years. But for the soldiers of the 6th Panzer Division, it was a warning they would not forget. The Soviets had machines that standard German weapons simply could not destroy. The assumptions they had carried from the campaigns in France, Poland, and the Low Countries no longer applied. This war in the East would be fought on entirely different terms. Within months, the encounters with KV tanks across the entire Eastern Front would trigger an urgent rethinking of German tank and anti-tank design. By November 1941, a special German tank commission was studying captured Soviet vehicles, including both the KV and the T-34 medium tank. The result would eventually reshape the entire German armored force. But in June 1941, none of that had happened yet. The men at that crossroads were learning the lesson for the first time. In 1965, more than 2 decades after the war ended, the remains of the tank crew were exhumed from their forest grave north of Raseiniai. Lithuanian officials and Soviet military representatives oversaw the reburial at the Soviet military cemetery in the town. A simple marker at the gravesite bears 2 names, Yershov P.E. and Smirnov V.A., one partial identification listed only as H-N-A, and 3 unknown soldiers. A visitor to the cemetery today can find that marker, 6 names or blanks carved in stone, the only physical trace of men who stopped an army. Historian Maxim Kolomets spent years trying to determine who these men were. He traced the tank to the 3rd Company of the 1st Battalion of the 1st Battalion of the 4th Tank Regiment, 2nd Tank Division. But the personal documents of the crew, which had been buried separately in the woods during the retreat, were never recovered. They were likely destroyed by the advancing German forces or simply lost to the weather and the years. The full names of the crew, their hometowns, their families, all of it is gone. But what they did is not gone. A single tank crew, stranded behind enemy lines with no fuel, no resupply, and no hope of rescue, chose to fight. They held a crossroads against an entire Panzer Division, absorbing everything the enemy threw at them until there was nothing left. At the start of this story, a supply convoy rolled down a road in Lithuania and found a tank that would not move. By the end, The men inside that KV had taught an invading army that this war would be unlike anything it had fought before. The crew never lived to see what their sacrifice meant, but in the brutal mathematics of June 1941, every hour the Soviet Union could buy with blood was an hour closer to survival. They bought those hours, and they paid in full.